Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. The last time I was here was in 2011, and I, of course, look at the economy now compared to 2011. I think it's especially welcome that we have this session on the long-term future of the economy, because essentially, if you think about the history of Ireland, is in crises we come together, we debate, we find solutions, whereas the history of the Irish economy is during the good years, there's a lack of risk management, there's a lack of preparation for the next downturn. So this is, I think it's probably common to the whole panel, this idea that you have to make that blend. You have to embrace the fact that to fully exploit long-term opportunities, you need the policies to do that. At the same time, you have to recognize that not every improvement in the economy is permanent. But equally, not every downturn is permanent either. You have to manage both the trend and the cycle. And that's not so easy for Ireland because there's so many different future pathways that are plausible. Because of the international mobility of technology, including intellectual property, the international movement of people, of firms, of workers, this economy can grow a lot, or it can also suffer significant reversals. So from the point of view, it's not too surprising from my point of view, what all of that says is you need a risk management perspective, which does not deny the importance of committing to policies for the long run, but trying to keep the economy safer in relation to any future reversal. So I hope I don't need to remind this audience that one categorization of the Irish economy is we've had 5 big crises. The economic war of 34 to 38, the emergency in World War II, the stagnation of the 50s, the 1980s stagnation, and then the severe crisis of 08 onwards. And of course, there's a global literature. We're not by far, there's been many crises around the world. But I think it's important to emphasize is they don't all come in the same flavor. So it is the case that sometimes a crisis follows a boom, which is what we had. But it's also possible you can have a crisis even when the economy is kind of just moving along normally, but something negative happens that pushes you from normal operation into a crisis. But it's also important to be symmetric about it. It's not the case that all booms are necessarily followed by a bust. So this is why, it's not so easy. You can't rely on fixed kind of principles about this. You really have to make the assessment. So sometimes a boom is followed by a plateau effect where you converge on a steadier rate of growth, but with no reversal. So, I think there was a lot of debate about soft landings 10 years ago. And the conundrum is it's not the case every boom is followed by a bust. Sometimes soft landings do happen, but it's a bit risky to assume they're going to happen. So let me mention right now is, as you've heard already, the economy is doing well, and I'll come back to that. But the paradox of what we have right now is the economy is doing well, both here at a European level, at a global level. But let me mention 4 pretty significant risk factors. One, as was mentioned, we've had, since the crisis, fairly easy international monetary conditions, including because of central bank policies, and also deeper issues to do with the way the world is working, the rise of emerging markets, the rise of finance coming out of, say, China, and so on. So, when we go to international meetings, it's been on the list for a long time now is, how is the world going to adapt when that goes into reverse? If and when it goes into reverse. Let's imagine there's a significant increase in risk aversion among global investors, and that people who are buying shares or buying houses on the assumption of one future suddenly revise their view of the future and what might happen then. So that's kind of just changes in market sentiment. A second one is a change in prospects for the world economy, where the most cited risk factor right now is the international trade war issue. We don't know whether the current potential trade conflicts will just turn out to be tactics, or whether it will actually transform into significant protectionism. The other two risks on our list, and which we talk about in our publications, are, and it's related to some of what we've talked about so far, is one, a shift in global tax practices that adversely affect small countries that host global multinational firms. So that's one, which is, and then the other one is hard Brexit, and that's, of course, going to hit us more than most other economies. Now, with all of those, I'm not saying they're going to happen. I'm not even going to say there's a very good way of saying the probability of any of those happening is some fixed number. But when you live in that world of uncertainty, the question is, what kind of policies do you put in place to kind of provide insurance, kind of policy insurance against those risks? So there's really two arms to that. One is for the financial sector, what we do at the central bank, and then what the government can do in terms of its fiscal strategy. So you may, if you follow the financial press, see that essentially in our policy work, we are essentially emphasizing more and more what's called macroprudential policies. That we have policies for the financial system basically to promote prudence, and that will basically, the benefit of which of these policies will only kick in the next downturn. So quite recently, we activated what's called a countercyclical capital buffer, which is basically saying to the banks, during these good years, you need to basically hold back more of your profits, add it to your reserves, to your capital, and so that in the next downturn, credit need not be cut because you've built a reserve of financing there. It's also the case in terms of our mortgage rules. Essentially, when you have these limits on loan to value, loan to income, what that means is if there's a downturn in the future, the distress that some of these households faced will be limited because by preventing excessive debt accumulation in the good years, it will limit the damage in the bad years. More generally, we are emphasizing to the banks, or we're requiring from the banks, to hold more and more loss-absorbing capital. So essentially, in the next, if there was a significant banking crisis in the future, it'd be less likely that these banks would fail. If they did fail, we have ways of shutting them down, and where the kind of taxpayer picking up the bill is essentially much less likely than it was last time. Now, if I turn to fiscal, there's a very similar philosophy we would be recommending, which is essentially, under these good conditions, yes, more public spending is desirable in many fronts, but in recognition that you may need some of those tax revenues in the future, it's also essentially to build up some surpluses, especially given that we still are quite indebted where we are now. And the reason for that is not basically to suppress any social goals, but to recognize that the only way to avoid having the austerity in the next downturn that we had in the last downturn is to build up the fiscal buffers in the good years. And if you look around the world, quite often it's governments with high ambitions for their public sector, which typically run surpluses in good years, because they really don't want to impose austerity in downturns. And so that's really, I think, very important to know that. So where are we now in terms of this issue about cyclical conditions? The reason why I'm emphasizing that these are cyclically strong conditions is in June, the latest unemployment number is 5.1%. So this is unemployment where you see it's back to the mid-2000s, that the huge increase in the crisis has now gone into reverse. But let me emphasize is that this is June 2018, it's 5.1, that the government for this year in its fiscal plans was assuming the average for this year would be 5.8. So, and it's also assuming for the next number of years, it would average around 5.3, 5.4. So the economy has moved ahead so much that these fiscal plans, which were assuming a worse performing economy, do need to be revised to recognize that, as Danny was saying, the economy is really moving along right now. By the way, 2 years ago in the 2016 Stability Programme update, where the government lays out its fiscal plan, it was assuming that unemployment in 2018 would be 7%, and that the range for 2019 to 2021 would be 6 to 6.6. So the economy, in terms of revising our expectations of where we are, we're cyclically ahead of where we expect it to be, and that calls for a revision in the budget plan as well. So let me emphasize is that right now the fiscal plan is essentially saying, well, of still having a deficit in 2019. Now, admittedly, a relatively small deficit, but to be running a deficit under these conditions is probably, I think, not in line with best principles of risk management. And indeed, in the government's summer economic statement a few weeks ago, there was an interesting presentation of showing that quite a number of small European economies with similar unemployment rates, and by the way, some of these countries have much safer fiscal positions, much lower public debts, are already running significant fiscal surpluses. So in that sense, in a comparative sense across Europe, we looked to be not making the same preparations, cyclical preparations as some of those. Now, in addition, in terms of the fiscal balance, the corporation tax revenues that we've talked about, it's hard to predict where they're going in the future, but the question is, if it's hard to predict where they're going in the future, do you assume they're all permanent in nature, or do you say, well, maybe some of that will dissipate, and if some of that is going to dissipate, it's more like a windfall, and some of that should really be saved and built up for the rainy day. It's also the case that part of the reason why the government's fiscal position has been improving is low interest rates. And as I indicated, many global factors might lead to an increase in the interest rates at 5 and 10 years relevant for government financing in the coming years. And then we do have a high legacy of both public debt and private debt. And so that calls for more prudence than normal. Let me say that I think there could be the next downturn, if and when it comes, would be a lot softer if through what we're doing at the central bank and if the government adhered to and delivered on fiscal prudence. And if you like, one of the big benefits of being able to more successfully manage the cycle is will allow us to turn more to the long term, to the big long-term issues here about economic development, social development. So let me talk about this graph here, which is the blue line is the headline GDP number, and then I'm a bit colorblind, so the lower line there is a GNI star, the famous GNI star. And what we have now from the results from last week, the week before, is headline GDP is 62% bigger than GNI star. So in terms, 62%. So in terms of thinking about the size of the economy, because often you'll hear tax revenues relative to GDP, healthcare spending relative to GDP, and so on. It's not a tiny correction to make when you say, well, actually the size of the economy is GNI star. By the way, GNI star, this is essentially the income available to us as the Irish population. It includes the corporation tax revenues paid by the multinationals. It includes all the earnings of whoever's working for these multinational firms, whichever local service providers are, contracting their services to these multinational firms. So it does capture the impact of the multinationals on the Irish population. I would totally agree. Given that dependence of GNI star on the multinationals, we absolutely have to think hard about the role of multinationals in the economy and so on. But this is a very big difference. So, for example, the stock of public debt to GNI star is 111%. So the public debt is still pretty high in normal metrics at 111%. Let me also emphasize is given that pattern, it's important to emphasize what I show here in this table. And by the way, over the weekend, you can it's online now at the Central Bank website, but you can study all of this at your leisure later on. This is a household disposable income per capita for the OECD. And what you see here is Ireland, I suppose I'd have a different view of the data than laid out by Danny. Ireland is not particularly at the top tier. There's still a long way to go. So the message here is there's a lot of room for improvement here over the long run. Our income level there is it's bracketed between Italy and Spain. That's where we are as a country in terms of what households have. Because, of course, the headline GDP number, a lot of profits are going to go to the multinational firms and so on. I think that's an important perspective to take. And if you go around the country, of course, there's many people doing very well, but there's plenty of people essentially with more regular experiences in terms of income and work. So in that context, it does say there's a lot to do. There's a lot of challenges for the long run. And let me emphasize also that in addition to the general issues about trying to raise living standards, have social progress, we have also two other challenges. One is the aging population, which is a reality, and we have to recognize that in terms of pensions policy, healthcare, home care, and so on, and more broadly about how we think about the aging population. And then the other one is climate change. So there's a lot to do in the coming years. So for example, in relation to aging, in the government's recent publication, between 2016 and 2040, the population above 65 will practically double from around 629,000 to 1.2 million. So if you go to other countries in Europe, you'll see this already, where essentially the typical person you meet is relatively advanced in age compared to what we have here. And then in terms of the transition to a low-carbon economy, that's a global challenge which we will have to share in meeting. So let me make 3 points about how are we going to deliver on our long-term ambitions. This from my perspective running the central bank, is number one is we need a well-functioning financial system. There's a big literature about the interaction between finance and development, but we can't pretend that we can grow without having an effective financial system. Because to enable the expansion of new firms, to enable capital accumulation, we need the financial system to provide the debt and the equity to fund the expansion. Importantly, we need a financial system that is open to external investors, because essentially when you think about the innovation, the structural change, the risks involved, having a global investor base is very beneficial in managing those risks. And although, of course, there's a lot of debate about the role of global investors in our crisis and recovery, the crisis would have been longer and more prolonged without the entry of global investors in 2011 and going forward from that. So it's really important that we have a legislative framework that strikes the appropriate balance between enabling global investors in protecting creditor rights, while of course recognising it's very important that the legal system does enable firms and individuals to have a second chance in terms of efficient resolution and restructuring when there's an excessive debt problem. And of course, the well-functioning financial system is essential in meeting the needs of an ageing population, not just in terms of pension coverage, but also life insurance and other saving schemes. So it's essential that we have a financial system that delivers in terms of low-cost products. It delivers in terms of being trusted, because it'd be a really crying shame, it'd be really damaging, I think, for long-term prosperity if consumers turn away from preparing for the long run because of lack of trust in the financial system. So our role as the regulator, of course, we're very committed to improving the behaviour and outcomes from the financial sector. And we published a culture report this week which indicated there has been progress, but there's a lot to do. And then also let me emphasise that one of the reasons why financial services are so costly here is risk. The crisis turned out to be very loss-making for many financial investors. And essentially, if we want consumers to have cheaper financial services in the future, we have to reduce those risk factors, which goes back to avoiding or limiting the scale of future downturns. We can't have a situation where we have these widespread defaults, widespread losses in the future. And so the stability of the economy and the financial system is an ingredient in achieving our long-term goals. So I have some text about climate change, but I think in the interest of time and allowing Q&A, I'm going to let you read that on the website. Let me make two other points. One is what's interesting is we often think about technology and so on as being crucial for long-term prosperity, which it is. But what's interesting is the academic economic research is increasingly emphasizing management skills. That poor management is a major factor both in the private sector and public sector for economies not reaching that top rank of countries. So I think, again, for the financial system, we are paying more and more attention to the quality of management practices in terms of governance, operational management, IT management, and again, going back to organizational culture, that it's really something not to be assumed just happens. Management, high quality management is really important in the private sector and the public sector. And let me emphasize, I don't exclude a central bank from an institution that, of course, it needs to commit to improving its management capability. And then finally, on public investment, I think you've heard from all of us that, I think there's a strong case for more public investment. But it's very important to emphasize this, that doesn't deliver quick wins. Public investment pays off over many decades. And so for that reason, you need a steady pace. It's damaging to have a prolonged period of cutbacks, but equally trying to accelerate public investment needs to be done at a reasonable pace, because in the short run, if you don't have the people to build the infrastructure, you do face some overheating risks. And so what we're saying in our work at the central bank is essentially, given the fact I've said earlier on, the government really should be running a surplus at this point, and given the fact that I also agree that there needs to be an increase in public investment, then what needs to happen is counterbalancing fiscal measures. As Danny mentioned earlier on, maybe part of that will have to be tax increases, because the balance between public and private is, I think, to strike that balance is very important, and to fund more public investment is going to be a big issue. So let me stop there. I think I've tried to maybe strike a middle ground here, saying there's a lot of challenges to meet our long-term goals. But we should be debating that and talking about that at these fora. But it's also not possible to de-link this cyclical risk management from long-term performance. I think the very least we can do in enabling success in the long term is to make sure we don't have the cyclical risk-taking we had in the past. And let me stop there.